Hi, my friends. This is Shmuel Gonzalez de Barrio Boychik, the founder of Boyle Heights History Studios Museum and Cultural Center, coming to you live from Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles. We're actually outdoors tonight. Today is the second night I am out on the town in the evening in order for us to be talking about some very vital history for the city of Los Angeles, some vital history for the Mexican-American, the Chicano cultural experience. Right now, I'm standing here in Boyle Heights at the corner of First Street and State Street. I'm right in between, our museum and Mariachi Plaza, to give you an idea of where we're standing right now. And I'm standing here today in front of this building in order to talk about the connection of this site to the historic Zoot riots, which took place this week 77 years ago. And throughout the week, we are going to be talking about the events of the so-called Zoot riots, which should otherwise be more properly known as the White Sailor riots. We are going to be, throughout this next week, be talking about the history of these riots in 1943. And we're going to be, of course, doing this in the backdrop of a lot of the protests and riots that are also going on within our country right now. I want us to lean into this history in order to see what we can glean from that history in order to arise to the situation today, and in order for us to understand the constant struggle that there is in civil rights for people of color within the city of Los Angeles and in our country. So throughout the next week, we're going to be talking about the history of the Zoot riots, the role that they have played in the city of Los Angeles, and in the experience of Mexican Americans that would give rise to the civil rights movement that we know today. The so-called Zoot riots, they begin on June 3rd, 1943, in the area just adjacent to Chavez Ravine, which we had visited yesterday. You'll find yesterday's video that we took in front of the Kim Sing Theater, which was the sparking place of the Zoot riots, starting on June 3rd. It was the location of one of the movie theaters in which, coming out of the movie theater, groups of soldiers as well as groups of Mexican Americans who had already had some animosity towards each other because of Mexican Americans feeling that the females were being mistreated by the sailors. Eventually what happens is that by the end of the night, one gregarious movement by a Mexican American who was talking with his hands was taken as someone trying to throw a punch. One sailor would descend on a Mexican American to start to beat him down. Consequently, all the Mexican Americans who were standing by, who greatly outnumbered the sailors, would retaliate, and the sailors would end up losing a rumble. They would be sent back to, they would crawl back to their barracks, and eventually what happens is that 4 days later, because this event would happen on a Sunday, later on a Thursday night, the group would return to the site in order to retaliate. And what you would find is sailors that would start to go into the movie theaters, into the dance halls, into the restaurants, into the stores, begin to grab young Mexican Americans and drag them into the streets. They would drag them into the streets, and they would not just beat them up, but they would also defrock them. They would also remove their suits, their Zoot suits, which was the style of many Mexican American young people at the time, leaving these young people as bloody pulps, naked in the middle of the street, before being arrested by the police that were complicit to all of this. And so what happens is that the riots began in the area of northern downtown Los Angeles and began to spread throughout that area. However, within the first night, the riots were pretty much localized to the northern downtown Los Angeles area. What happened in the end, though, is that none of the sailors who ended up rioting against Mexican Americans and going in this mob attack were end up arrested in the end. What happens is that the police and shore patrol were called, but they had never caught up with them. They were later interviewed about it that night. However, they were just released back to the custody of the armory, and no one was charged for the mob violence that had gone on. And so what happens is that naturally the violence was going to continue and was going to spill over into additional nights. Now, tonight we are commemorating the second night of the Zoot Riot. And so June 4th was a Friday night. And this is different because what happens is that on this night, you have shore patrol. You have a problem in that shore patrol is not going to really be able to contain or be able to keep up with all of the sailors that are starting to flock into the city on the weekend because they are on shore leave. During the weekends, you would have as much as 100,000 sailors that would be here within the greater Los Angeles area on shore leave. And what were they mostly out doing? Looking for a good time, looking to drink and to, go to the dance spots. And also, eventually, some of these would also lead into looking for girls and inevitably some of these brawls. However, this weekend, it would be a little bit more intense as you would see crowds of people that would be coming in caravans as far as San Diego, having been fed urban legends and news about the riots that had taken place the night before. And so what happens is that you would end up with Los Angeles being flooded by service personnel who are deciding that they're going to come in while they're on shore leave for the weekend in order to riot against Mexican Americans. And so that is what happens on the second night. However, there is something different that happens within the second night of the riots, is that they do not contain themselves to downtown Los Angeles. One of the things that really sparked the riots on top of it all was that as the city is being flooded with service personnel during the time of World War II, there are many people that are coming from other parts of the country in which because of segregation in the country and because of racial isolation, they're not used to seeing Mexican Americans, let alone seeing Mexican Americans in large numbers who are starting to flood the downtown area in order to engage themselves in the nightlife, going to the movie theaters, going to the cafes, going to the dance clubs, and all of these different places. And this is rather unique because Mexican Americans at this time in the early 1940s, young Mexican Americans are of the first generation of people that are actually really venturing to try to challenge the racial segregation of Jim Crow, which is ingrained into our country and especially into this city at this time. Previous generations were fine to go back to their own barrios after they had done all the menial jobs and cleaned up the buildings and whatever they did downtown for their work, and then come back home, and that's where they would engage in going to movie theaters and dancing and stuff like that. However, young Mexican Americans at this time who are coming out of the Great Depression, getting new jobs because of the wartime jobs that are coming, young American-born Mexicans, they have seen good times come, and what they want to do is, for the first time, they want to involve themselves in the interest of a general popular society. They want to go see the Hollywood films, they want to go dance to the swing music, and they want to go in style. And thus the Zoot suit. At that time, Mexican Americans who are being given jobs, oftentimes, creating items for the war. Such as within our area, how most young people were able to afford their Zoot suits was in high school, you were given jobs, either part day or in some cases full day. You're able to work on constructing warplanes, constructing bombers that were going to be used in the war. And they, paid you on the minimum wage, which was 60 cents at the time. And but it was the minimum wage, and that was pretty good wages at the time. And young people, for the first time, had money. And as we say in the Mexican tradition, el que nunca tenía nada cuando tiene loco volver. Those who have never had anything, when they have it with it, they're going to go crazy. And that's what really happened. For the first time, people were enabled with just a little bit of money in order to be able to finally be part of, the nightlife and the style. And people lunged at it. Young Mexican Americans lunged at that with glee. As a matter of fact, a Zoot suit in those days, a nice Zoot suit cost $29.95. So a week's worth of work got you very close to being able to do that. And so that is really one of the, the complications for Mexican Americans at that time, is that they, mistakenly, really believed the American rhetoric that, if you, just behave, and you just try to fit in, that everything should be fine for you. Once they start, coming into the downtown areas in large numbers, and because they are Americans, in a city in which we are large numbers walking around with confidence, this really perplexed and indeed offended a lot of soldiers who came out from other places. And at this time, what many people had in their minds was that the soldiers, they were asking for other sailors to come in from other places in order to show those Mexicans who was in charge, that those Mexicans thought that this town was theirs and we had to show them different, was the way that the soldiers sent out these calls to people. And it indeed attracted people all throughout Southern California who came to engage in battle against young Mexican Americans. One of the sad things about this is that, the Zoot suit, wearing the Zoot suit, which was the popular style at the time, would also catch the ire of many white people in America because of its origins. First off, it was, it had emerged from the jazz swing, subculture of African Americans, and therefore it was considered colored people's clothing in a time of Jim Crow segregation. And this was something that was subversive, was considered very, very subversive. On top of it all, during the lean times of war, as people are trying to ration all kinds of things, what happens is that if people are making these grand, glorious outfits with inseams as much as 42 inches at the legs, what happens is that some people thought that that type of peacockery, that was un-American. If they were, true patriotic Americans, then they would be, saving, they would be rationing, instead of using up all of this cloth. And so consequently, the Zoot suit is considered not just a Negro form of dress, but an un-American form of dress. And so that's, there's a vilification of young people who wear the Zoot suit. And so that is one of the issues, is that as young people are, out on the town, the Zoot suit becomes an identifier, and it becomes a symbol in order for people to attack these young people. One of the other arguments that is made along those lines is that the Zoot suit was taken by a lot of people of look, and not only are they wasting all of this material, but they are draft dodgers. If they were real Americans, they would not be wearing these black kids' outfits, but they would be suited up for the war effort. And disregarding exactly how we had been able to afford these, actually contributing to the war effort. And so that is, one of the things that seems to be kind of misunderstood as the vilification of the Zoot suit, really comes into form. But what we do need to keep in mind, though, is that, as young people are being encountered in the downtown, what they're doing is they're catching young people. They're not just beating them up, but they're ripping the Zoot suits from them, and they're lighting them on fire like flags in the middle of the streets. And, leaving the young people bloodied and naked before they're being arrested by the police who are being complicit to this. However, in the first day, most of the rioting is contained to the downtown area. There are mobs that are roving around downtown Los Angeles looking for Mexican Americans in order to attack as they encounter them. The second night, we actually have something different in which now that the sailors are on shore patrol, we actually have incursions of sailors that are coming into the barrio, that are coming in on the streetcars and are also being driven in from, as far away as San Diego in order to be part of the riots here. No longer are they satisfied with just being downtown and beating up what Mexican Americans they encounter. They're actually going to come into the heart of the Mexican American community here in Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles, and start to go on an attack. And one of the first locations that is attacked during the Zoot Suit riots here in Boyle Heights is this location right behind me. I'm standing in front of what was known as the Pentrolli's Ballroom. The Pentrolli's Ballroom goes back to the 1920s, and it goes back to that first half of the 20th century in which this community was a red line community. It was a designated racial community for ethnic people who are not allowed to live in other parts of the city. So this neighborhood was not just a Mexican American community, but also had African American people, Jewish people, as well as Italian people, the Pentrollis. And so Pentrolli's Ballroom was really one of the most loved night spots here within the neighborhood in which people came to cut up the dance floor. Interestingly enough, during the wartime, this would also become one of the places where people would go to celebrate their last night of freedom before going to war. Many had been drafted into World War II, and everyone wanted to have one big hurrah before they went off to war. And so this became the location where most people had their last night, their last hurrah of freedom before they were deployed into World War II. And so what happens is that on this night, it would have been filled with a bunch of people when sailors descended upon this place, going into the second story of the ballroom and identifying young Mexican Americans and dragging them out into the street before stripping them of their Zoot suits and beating them to a pulp. But again, one of the things I want to point out about this is that this was a location that was not just a local, like, watering hole and dance location. This actually became one of the most thriving places of nightlife during the time of World War II, as you have an influx of people that are coming in, with increased wartime jobs and with people being drafted into the war. This becomes one of the primary places where people, again, are having some of their, last celebrations before they are going to be deployed in the Pacific. That's normally what people were coming out in this direction for, in order to be deployed in the Pacific with the Navy or the Marines. And so consequently, this becomes hugely popular during the wartime. And one of the things that I want to point out is that it's really, really tragic that during this time one of the things that makes Mexican Americans victims is that in the backdrop of World War II, during a time of great nationalism, there was there was not just a lot of racism, but there was a lot of witch hunting, people looking out for people that they considered un-American. And unfortunately, there was a lot of people that were unfairly judged during that time, such as Mexican Americans. Sadly, Mexican Americans are going to be attacked during the Zoot riots, and are going to be attacked in future attacks, because throughout the war, Mexican Americans are constantly going to be accused of draft dodgers who are staying home here and are making a bunch of money off of the war machine. You know, that they're not really in it for patriotism. They're just doing it for the money. If if they were real patriots, then they would sign up for the war. What is important for us to note, though, is that at this point in history, Latinos, all encompassing, that's when you put Mexican Americans along with Puerto Ricans and Cubans and everyone, make up somewhere between 3 to 5% of the population of the United States. However, Mexican Americans at this point are making up about 20% of the U.S. soldiers which are serving, in uniform. So what that means is that Mexican Americans are actually signing up in higher numbers than Anglos are, than Caucasians are for the war. And so this is one of the really negative tropes that that really fueled the riots at the time, and would continue to be carried down as a slur for years by people who misunderstood the situation of the Zoot riots. But one of the things I do want to point out is that, yes, we did have the Zoot riots actually happening in our own backyard. It just was not contained to the area of downtown Los Angeles. We did actually have incursions of the sailors who were coming in order to beat Mexican Americans in their own neighborhoods. And, they figure, like if you wanted to find a Mexican American to beat, why not go to the source? Let's go to their community. And the thing about that is that finally, when they got to this neighborhood, unfortunate for us, unfortunate for them, they were greatly outnumbered. And so, believe it or not, within short period of time here in the neighborhood, there began to be a resistance by local residents to try to repel the sailors who were coming in and rioting into the neighborhood. What they would do is that you had local residents that were starting to do their own self-patrolling. And I say self-patrolling because the police are actually aiding, in the rioting and all of this. So, the thing is that it's not like you can depend on the police for this. So there are groups within the neighborhood that are self-patrolling in order to stop mobs of sailors from encroaching further into the community in order to beat people. The furthest that anyone really got within the neighborhood it was to Evergreen, to First and Evergreen. There is a case of one young man who's noted within the newspapers of getting as far as Evergreen when he gets off the trolley car there at First Street. And as soon as he gets off with, gear in order to, riot, people notice that he has riot gear, and they kick his ass, put him on another trolley car, and send him back the other way. Also, on Whittier Boulevard in Euclid, they had set up a roadblock in order to stop the sailors from, crouching into East Los Angeles. So about halfway through Boyle Heights, you had a roadblock that stopped the sailors from being able to go into East LA proper. So consequently, the ability for the sailors to be able to riot within East Los Angeles was limited by a resistance of local people within the neighborhood that were able to deflect those types of attacks. And, you know, in the backdrop of what is currently going on within our city, as we have all of this protest, and as you know, we do certainly have some people taking advantage of the situation and, you know, engaging in looting and stuff like this. What is kind of interesting to note is that historically, Boyle Heights has not really suffered from looting. Even though we have been through almost every major type of riot, there has been some, you know, there have been you know, demonstrations, and, you know, we've been tied into the overall kind of unrest within the city. But interestingly enough, we have never had mass looting that's happened within the neighborhood of Boyle Heights, and that's mostly because, you know, within the neighborhood, we've had self-policing groups that stand, you know, in front of the business in order to defend the businesses. And so consequently, within the Zoot riots, within here in the neighborhood, one of the things that you would not see here within Boyle Heights that you would have seen in other places such as Watts, was you know, not just the beating of people, but eventually the destruction of property and looting and stuff like that going on. That type of stuff happened in neighborhoods like Watts, but it was deflected by people in this neighborhood who resisted that. And so that is rather important for us to know. But yeah, throughout the rest of the week, we are going to be talking about, you know, what, you know, the legacy of the Zoot riots is, you know, what its impact was, not just in that time, but how the effects of it ring down in history. As, you know, this is really one of these moments in which our people start to deal with the situation of mass criminalization of Mexican American people, mass criminalization that is going to, you know, affect us to this day. And so I want us to continue to be able to talk about, you know, the ways historically Mexican Americans have been portrayed by the media, the way that, you know, they have been, you know, the way that they have been villainized, you know, by law enforcement, and, you know, put it side by side. One of the things, though, I do before, you know, I get, you know, before I wrap up this lesson, before I get ahead of myself, one of the things I want to remind us is that, you know, when we look back at the Zoot era, what we're talking about is the experience that Mexican Americans went through when we tried to challenge the Jim Crow segregation of this city, in which we were being subjected to the same type of treatment that African American people were being treated. That we in the city were segregated. We were treated as colored people in all of the same manners, with going to, you know, theaters, with, you know, housing, and all of these different matters. And what happens when Mexican Americans decide that they are going to challenge the boundaries of segregation in the Jim Crow era? And that's really important for us to think about. How far have us as Mexican Americans come within that time? How far have we come? And how much more do we need to, fight in order to experience true equality in this country? And you know, how we also need to ask ourselves, how much farther have we advanced beyond the experience of African Americans? How far have us Mexican Americans been able to advance far beyond some of the ways that African Americans have in recent years? It is important that for those of us who have in some ways been able to already be able to advance, already be able to, you know, integrate, already be able to achieve a lot of our civil rights gains. We need to be reflective of a lot of those civil rights gains that are still left. They're still left to be, to be actualized, to be realized by African Americans. We are still in this struggle together, my neighbors. We're still in this struggle together, brothers and sisters. And that's really important for us to keep in mind. You know, not too long ago, it was us Mexican Americans who were in the same boat as African Americans, and we need to extend our reach to African Americans in order to help them in their time of need. They have been with us this entire time. It's time for us to be with them. And I think that's really, what I want us to focus on, within this week. Hopefully within this next week, I see many of you coming out in order to join in the protests that are out there going on in the streets of our major cities. There are peaceful protests that are going on all across America in order to raise awareness about, police brutality. And I hope that you join and that you continue to also join us as we continue to talk about the history of the Zoot riots and the legacy of how we continue to tell the story of this important chapter of Mexican American history, how we hand it down in storytelling to this day. Have a good night, everyone. I will see you tomorrow as we commemorate night 3 of the Zoot riots. Have a good night.